All right, and we're live. So this is going to get recorded for our YouTube channel. So greetings, welcome everyone. Welcome to a new episode of our live streamed, not live stream, but recorded podcast. Today we have Hunter Hastings, who is an entrepreneur, who is also an author, the writer of several books on economics and entrepreneurship, and who is I'm not sure if you're a member of the Mises Institute, who contributes to the Mises Institute for his series podcast on Austrian economics and entrepreneurship. And who is our guest today? My name is Ugo Stornaiolo Silva. I am the international correspondent for Navarra Confidencial or España Confidencial, depending on which page you're using. And today we shall talk with Hunter about many great things, mostly entrepreneurship and Austrian economics.
Good. Well, Hugo, it's nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. So, thank you to you for accepting our interview and to come here. My first question usually is to ask our guests to introduce themselves so our audience can know better about them.
Yes, well, I'll be happy to. I'm currently in San Diego in the United States, which is a long way from where I was born, which was in the United Kingdom. So I grew up there. I was educated there, and I entered into the world of industry with an American company called Procter Gamble that makes household products, detergents and washing liquids and those kinds of things. That got me to the USA. Then I became an entrepreneur in consulting. So the marketing and business management I'd learned at Procter Gamble became a useful service to other companies. I developed a number of consulting products, intellectual products. I started a couple of consulting companies. Then I got diverted into Silicon Valley. In the late 1990s, I was CEO of a company that was funded by Procter & Gamble to try and put marketing processes into software. So we did that for a while. Procter & Gamble eventually changed their mind and took that software in-house. So I started another consulting company to help other global marketers and global brand owners do the same thing. And then latterly, I've been in the venture capital world trying to help other entrepreneurs to get started with their entrepreneurial journeys. And then I also run a program with a number of other people at the Mises Institute that we call Economics for Business. And that is the application of the principles of Austrian economics to business and especially to entrepreneurial businesses. I'm not sure if your listeners will be fully familiar with Austrian economics, and I know you are. I'd be happy to give more background, but that's where I am now, running the Economics for Business project with a lot of other people at Mises Institute. That includes not only the podcast by that same name, but also we've built an online platform for learning and for tools and for a community that will come together in developing entrepreneurship.
Well, I think that most of our viewers and of our audience is going to be familiar with Austrian economics. Good. I mean, not all of our audience is libertarian, or at least is trained in Austrian economics, but they do like free market and the market economy. So I think that they will do fine. Good. But how did you get involved? How did you become interested in Austrian economics? Because from entrepreneurship to the application of economics of a very particular school is something very different, and there's a long road from that point to the other.
Right. Well, my journey is a journey of what I call unlearning. So I have an economics degree from Cambridge University in the UK, which is the worst possible place to learn economics because it was dominated by Keynes and Keynesianism. That's where Keynes studied and taught and developed all of his awful theories. And that was a tremendous grip on the British economy and the European economy. In fact, Murray Rothbard said that the socialist revolution in the UK that took place right after the end of World War II was the most powerful such revolution in the world. They nationalized a lot of industries, transportation and steelmaking and the health service and many others. It became a very socialist country. So that's what I was taught, and I realized there was something wrong with that. And I eventually discovered Hayek, and that's where I started. And the reason I discovered Hayek was because a prime minister in the UK by the name of Margaret Thatcher, who tried to reverse the socialism trend, was a big reader of Hayek. So I started reading Hayek. I then discovered, going backwards, Menger and Böhm-Bawerk. I eventually got to Mises. Then somewhere along the way, I discovered Rothbard, and then I discovered the Mises Institute. So I've been on a learning process for 50 years to unlearn what they taught me and learn what is Austrian economics. And that becomes a deep and lasting pursuit, not only in intellectual understanding, but also in business understanding, as you said, free markets and entrepreneurship and how value is created. So I'm very passionate about it, very deeply involved in it. I would like to make it available to everybody in the world.
Yeah, well, I think that the Thatcher influence in the free market world and the free market understanding of economics is very important. I mean, in Latin America, actually, most of the people who are interested in free markets have somewhat of a vague memory of Reagan and of the free trade agreements that we did back then with the United States. So there's a relation in that. But yeah, you told me you studied at Cambridge, and that Cambridge was pretty much the birthplace of Keynesianism. And so what's the reason for you to go from that point? I mean, Keynes was a very important proponent of government intervention, and then you come to the other place, you come to Mises, to Hayek, to Rothbard, who are telling everyone, no, the government should not intervene and people should be free to do as their please. What did change your mind?
Well, I think, Hugo, it's a social vision. So we all have a set of highest values. Rothbard explains how we have a ladder of values. There's something that we're striving for that drives us in our lives, purpose and meaning. And what I've developed, along with a lot of other people over time, is this idea of an entrepreneurial society. So if you believe in entrepreneurship, it's a very other-directed, positive kind of a philosophy. You're trying to create value for other people. And the Austrian definition of value is well-being. It's your own good feeling. It's your own sense of prosperity. It's happiness. It's a better life. And an entrepreneur is somebody who perceives that need in other people and discovers or develops a way to meet that need, i.e. make other people feel better. So that's a very positive, other-directed, friendly, loving kind of society. It's the opposite, I always say, of politics. Politics is hate. Politics, you have to win or lose. I've got to beat you. I've got to knock you senseless as I change your mind about what you believe in. Whereas entrepreneurship is the opposite. It's I want to make you feel better. I'll try to learn the best way to do that. I'll try to gather the resources to help you, and you can't help yourself, or you can't do what I do because I've got a differentiated capability. And if the world were entrepreneurial, then it would be a much better place. It would be a reversal of the political world that we have now. So the whole Austrian concept of economics being about individuals, about people, about freedom, about helping others is just so persuasive to me. It's so inspiring. And so that's what drives me. That's what got me there.
Well, I think that none of the schools of economics have that much interest in business and in entrepreneurship as the Austrian school does. I mean, when you look at the classical school, the neoclassical school, Keynes and Marxists, they do not care about business. Well, they do care about business, but they do not care about entrepreneurship at all. They just mean, no, it's part of the business cycle, it's part of the economic cycle and everything, but they don't understand the meaning of entrepreneurship in the economics and in society. So my question for you would be, what's your understanding of the importance of business, like in society, in economics in general?
Right, you're exactly right, Ugo. We say that the entrepreneur is absent from mainstream economics, from neoclassical economics, just not there. They can't explain that phenomenon. And in Austrian economics, you build from the bottom up, not from the top down. So mainstream economics thinks the economy is gross domestic product. It's big aggregates. It's the employment level and the money supply and those big numbers, and they can put those numbers into equations. There's no human beings there. And in Austrian economics, it's all about human beings. And so we think about how individual humans seek value. Mises called it betterment. We imagine a future in which things are better, and then we strive to get there. And then we find that collaboration is a good way to do that. So that could be Adam Smith's division of labor, or it could be the creation of a firm. So a firm is a collaboration. It's a way human beings work together to create value for others. So the firm is fundamental. Business is fundamental. Now, what we're discovering is that how it's organized is a place where Austrian economics can really help. So one of the tendencies over the past 150 years is for some markets to be dominated or heavily influenced by large companies, giant corporations. And they tend to become intertwined with government in a bad way. In America, we call it crony capitalism. I don't know whether that term exists where you are, but it's this intertwining of big companies and governments in a negative fashion. We can organize entrepreneurship differently today. We can organize it because of the internet and because of digital technology as a network of firms of all different sizes, but not necessarily those dominant crony firms. And so Austrian economics understands that. So we can look at business as a great positive, a creator of value meaning we make people's lives better, a collaboration of individuals and small groups and small teams, and it creates the economy. Business is the economy in the sense of it's that accumulation of value. It's people's well-being. You need business to create that, and they listen to feedback from customers. If customers buy, then we'll do more of what we're doing. If customers don't buy, we'll try something else. It's a very collaborative way of improving people's lives. So business is very positive in economics. It's not exploitative. It's not in any way taking value away from customers or workers. It's all positive, all contributive.
Well, the term of crony capitalism, I think, is universal in English. Some people like to use corporatism or corporativism or even corporatocracy. I mean, these terms can define something, but they're not very similar to what crony capitalism actually means. In Spanish, we have this slang term. We call them empresarios, which is a play on empresario, which is entrepreneur, businessman, and dinosaur, because they are like kind of predators to the rest of business and to workers especially. But my question for you in this point would be, and there's a clear difference between this kind of crony capitalist and the entrepreneur. And I think that the main difference is in the way they allocate resources and the way they produce and the way they actually work in the economy. for instance, the crony capitalist, he tries to monopolize. The entrepreneur tries to have competition with other entrepreneurs and to be the best. What other difference do you think there are between an entrepreneur and a crony capitalist, especially from the Austrian economics perspective?
Yeah, there are really two major elements for me, Ugo. One is that as businesses get bigger, they tend to become defensive. So instead of creating new things, always looking for new opportunities, experimenting, exploring, which is what entrepreneurs do, they become defensive. If you read some of the old literature in business, they talk about defending market share, and then a lot of military analogies come in. It's a war against competition, and you've got to defeat them, and those kinds of negative thoughts come in. So they become defensive. Instead of exploring and innovating, they defend what they've already got, and that's what leads to monopoly and those other kinds of negatives that you cited there. So one is this change from positivism to defensiveness, which you get at some point in time as companies scale. And then the second is bureaucracy. There's a very famous book by Mises called Bureaucracy, which is the diversion of the activities of the company from the profit motive, let me see how I can best serve customers, to process and compliance. And this is where we get the integration with government. So the more and more bureaucracy that you generate in these big corporations, the less and less you're creating value for customers. Those bureaucrats are not charged with making a profit. They're charged with preserving, with enforcing processes and complying with regulations and all of those practices which are not directed towards the customer. So those two things, I think, defending what they've already got and developing bureaucracy are the two things that condemn these giant companies to slow growth and scleroticism and sometimes failure. That's a trend that we observe, and we've got to figure out how to end it.
Well, your point is very similar to the one of a conservative author called James Barham, who wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution, in which instead of explaining that businesses become more bureaucratic, he told his readers that the state becomes more like a business. So it becomes managerial, and so the bureaucrats become like managers. And this is what's happening both in business and the state. Instead of working to make profit and working to protect liberties. But anyway,
yeah, no, you're right about Burnham, and that's a good thread. And one of the places where we think that some of these problems arise is in business school, that they teach a product that we call strategic management, which is all about defensiveness and finding what they call competitive advantage, which is another way of talking about striving for monopoly and protecting your position and those kinds of things. Strategy is all about defensiveness, about carving out your own ground. And they don't teach true entrepreneurship, which is value creation, exploration, discovery, experimentation, finding out what works, listening to the feedback from consumers. And so that thread that Burnham started about the managerial revolution, which he was referring mostly to, how government was becoming managerial, it's also applying in corporations. So the two threads are parallel. You're right.
Well, since you talked about competitive advantage, this is a kind of term that we read in the works of David Ricardo, the protege of Adam Smith, or even in the works of von List, the German nationalist economist of the 19th century, I think. And so, that's the thing. You said previously that politics, it's very competitive, and there's a sense of the enmity between the people who are competing in politics, and that's applying to economics and to business as well. Pretty much, Carl Schmitt said that politics is the distinction between friend and enemy. So this is kind of what's happening in the rest of society, in, let's say, in business, in education as well, and so on and so forth. But I think that there's a difference between that. Or
sorry,
go on, please.
One of the things we have to improve is this definition of competition, maybe our understanding of competition, and maybe it's not a word that we should use. So when we think of it entrepreneurially, it's, Rothbard called it rivalry, that we're trying to do better for the consumer. If you make a product that the consumer likes, I'm going to make one that they like more. That's more value, more betterment, more improvement. So competition in that sense is a very, very positive, socially beneficial kind of a term. When it's used as a negative, I've got to beat you, I've got to keep you out, I've got to criticize you, I've got to undermine your business, then it's very negative. And the idea of competitive advantage has devolved in the business school on that negative side, whereas the rivalry that entrepreneurs conduct is all positive. It's all for the benefit of the customer, and that's the difference. It's what's best for the customer and the consumer.
Do you think this concept of positive rivalry between entrepreneurs and between firms can be related to the concept of creative destruction that applies in capitalism?
Yeah, so the creative destruction comes from Schumpeter, as you know, and he was trying to disprove in economics the theory of equilibrium, which is what neoclassical economics is about. Eventually, supply and demand become equal. The market is in equilibrium, and all of the equations point in that direction. That's the way neoclassical economists think, and it's all wrong. It's not the way the world works. So Schumpeter observed that, and he created this term, creative destruction, meaning that innovators come along and people with new ideas, they find new ways to do things. You know, Henry Ford invents the motor car and the continuous production chain, and it changes the economy. It's not in equilibrium, it's in disequilibrium. And the destruction part was, that means that businesses that were in place now have been displaced and they've got to make adjustments. Now, sadly, everybody remembers the destruction part and not the creative part. The creative part is positive, and then Schumpeter put destruction on it. But it's not destruction, it's adaptiveness. It's constantly changing to do better for the customer. So I think maybe we should lose the idea of competition, certainly lose the idea of destruction, and think of adaptiveness, think of constant change. Mises in Human Action called it constant flux. It's our condition. Everything is changing all the time. And Hayek says the same thing about society. So think about living in that world where everything is changing. With entrepreneurs, everything's changing for the better. I just invented something that's better for you. Now, somebody who's my rival now has to adapt, has to change, has to make their thing better. So it's all positive if you think of it as change, as a process, as opposed to equilibrium, which is static, and then the invention disturbs that equilibrium. So you're thinking negatively, and Austrians think positively. It's all good, it's all positive change.
Well, right now, there's a classmate of mine who is listening to our recording, and he's very interested in labor unions and labor law and syndicates. And so my question for you is, since you already told me that there's a concept of rivalry in business and in society, and this concept can apply to Marxism, in which there's a rivalry between the bourgeois class, who is the one who is doing the entrepreneur, and the proletariat who is doing the work. How do you think these can be disrupted by the Austrian understanding of economics?
Well, you have to understand through this theory of change how situations like being a worker and earning a wage and getting benefits evolved. And Marx obviously looked at that in the negative sense. He thought about exploitation, and if the entrepreneur makes a profit, he must not be paying the workers enough because value is all in the work, which is, it's all wrong. But people go to work for corporations or for entrepreneurs for positive reasons. They'd rather get a wage than face the uncertainty of being an entrepreneur. And uncertainty is not attractive to some people. So let me have the certainty of that weekly wage, and then I'm going to negotiate with you for what is my value, and we come to an agreement. It's a contract. A contract is agreement where both sides get value. So that's the positive, and the Marxian negative cast is just not realistic in any fashion. So the worker has to understand the process of how they create value, how they get paid for it. If they don't think they're getting enough, they can go work for somewhere else. The union idea is that I will negotiate through the threat of strikes to raise the wages of the workers, irrespective of how much value they're creating. So that's a negative. That's a bottleneck. That's a destruction of value. And so, personally, I'm a big fan of a free market in labor. I think that's becoming more and more the case. I don't know about where you are, but in the US, unions are becoming less and less relevant. People don't want to be part of a union, except the people who work for the government. Unions are still dominant in the public sector.
Well, I kind of like the guild system of the Middle Ages, and well, it's more of a sentiment, actually. So wait a sec. All right, and so well, since the firm, the entrepreneur tries to make a profit, the Austrian school, which promotes this kind of entrepreneurship, is actually very capitalist. But do you think there's something else in the entrepreneurial work apart from making a profit to accumulate capital to go on with the entrepreneurial work?
Well, two points there, Ugo. One is profit is a signal from the customer, from society in general, if you like, that the entrepreneur is using resources in a way that the customer approves of, and that the signal is do more of it. So if you run through the monetary calculation, profit is the difference between what the customer is willing to pay and what the entrepreneur's cost of production is, and that's simply a margin. And the profit is the signal of, yes, I like this enough that I'll pay you an amount of money that you can make a profit on. And it also, as you said, fuels the future accumulation of capital. And that's good for everybody because it increases our productivity, and then it creates more betterment, more value. So profit is a signal from society that the entrepreneur is doing a great job. The second part is that there's a huge non-monetary part of profit, of the entrepreneur's purpose and meaning. And Rothbard called it psychic profit, or you can call it meaning. You can call it a sense of purpose or a sense of achievement. But people who are entrepreneurs, whether they start their own businesses or they work for an entrepreneurial company or they're doing entrepreneurial work in a corporation, like developing new products and services, there's a huge psychic benefit to that. I feel better. That's a better life to live than being a wage slave. That's a purpose and meaning which I can pursue throughout my entire life, developing new value for people. So we think of profit in those two ways. It's the monetary calculation of the difference between willingness to pay and cost. That's one part. And then the second part is the psychic benefit of purpose and meaning. And there's huge amount of research that show that people engaged in entrepreneurial activities have a greater sense of meaning and purpose in life. They feel more fulfilled. They have a sense of achievement. It's a better way for them to be engaged. So both of those are really important parts of profit.
Well, when we talk about being better off, that means also that we're better off right now, which means that we can consume or we can have more options to do uh, in the current moment. And so when I think of this, there's the concept of low and high time preferences, and also the concept of saving and of consumption and of spending and so on and so forth. And so in the Keynesian school, there's a lot of emphasis in spending, whereas in the Austrian school, there's a lot of emphasis in saving. What do you think is the relation between saving and entrepreneurship?
Well, in economic theory, of course, it's the savings in the economy that are not used in consumption today, so they fuel investment and capital accumulation for the future. And as you say, time preference, it's a really important part of Austrian economics and something that non-Austrian economists don't really get, that civilization is better with a higher time preference, the willingness to save, the willingness not to consume today, but to invest what I could have consumed tomorrow. That drives progress. It drives civilization. It makes lives better. If you have a high time preference, as you say, you're going to consume now and not save, and then your future is not going to be so good. So it's a really, really important part of understanding economics. And the entrepreneur is the essential saver. The entrepreneur is always living in the future, always saying, hey, I can see how to create value. It's going to take me some time. It's going to take me some resources, which I may have to get from other capitalists who have saved in order to fund me. So that time preference, savings, and investment, the entrepreneur is the nexus of that, the whole essence of it. So the more entrepreneurs we have, the more civilized and the more progress we'll make. In fact, I'm a big fan of Jesus Huerta de Soto. Excuse me if I didn't pronounce the name very well. But he says that the most just and the most fair society is the one that best promotes the creativity of its entrepreneurs. Now, he thinks that everybody thinks, works, or acts entrepreneurially. Everyone's thinking about the future and what can I do today to make a better future. But through entrepreneurship, if we unleash that creativity, that forward thinking, that futurist bent, then we have a better society. Everybody is better off. It's not about redistribution. It's about letting everybody be a creative entrepreneur. And I love that vision of De Soto's.
Well, some people are entrepreneurs and some others are not. And well, there's right now a clear difference between one who is an entrepreneur and one who is not. But do you think there's the entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurial quality, something one is born with, or one can become an entrepreneur in his or her life?
Yeah, that's a very interesting and a very difficult question, I think, Ugo. I think I can summarize what the data is, that entrepreneurs are people who are able to deal with uncertainty. I've got an idea. I think it will be successful in the marketplace. I can't be sure, and therefore I'm willing to take on that uncertainty. Now, there are various theories about how entrepreneurs do that. I think there's a point in the process before judgment, before I act, before I do something, that we could call orientation. It's a way of thinking. There's a famous study by Gallup, the big research company, about entrepreneurial strengths. What are those entrepreneurial strengths? And part of it is this relationship with risk. I'm not scared by risk. In fact, I'm energized by it. This is exciting to start this business or launch this brand or take on this project. And I'm good at reacting to what happens and adjusting. That's the adaptiveness. So I'd call it orientation. I think we can change your orientation or our own orientation over time. You know, Hayek in the sensory order talked about how we have a map that started building in our minds when we were born, and we take in information and we create that map, and that guides us. That's our orientation. But then new information or new experiences or something new comes in, and I've got to create something new to add to that map. In fact, he gave a different name. He called it the model. And so our map is always evolving and changing. So I think our orientation, our relationship to risk, where we get to the point where we say, I love risk, I'm gonna try this, I think it can change over time. So I think everybody can be an entrepreneur in theory, and that we can change our orientation over time. And the vision of an entrepreneurial society, like De Soto said, is that more and more people are unleashed in that direction. So I'm taking the point of view that everybody can be an entrepreneur.
But in order to be an entrepreneur, there's a need for certain requirements in culture and in law and in the way people are organized in society politically in order to be an entrepreneur. I mean, you cannot be an entrepreneur in Venezuela or in in any of these socialist countries in Africa, but you can be an entrepreneur in the United States, or let's say Liechtenstein.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think this happened?
Yeah, context is really important, and that you're exactly right. The legal environment and the intervention orientation of the government and so on, the opportunities to be entrepreneurs is really restricted. But there are a couple of interesting developments. There's a entrepreneur here in the US. His name is Mauricio Miller. He was a Mexican immigrant. His mother came to the US from Mexico. She was very, very poor, but she found a way to make clothing for people in her neighborhood, and eventually that became a business. And Mauricio spent 20 years in the government working for the social services to help poor people, ostensibly. And his conclusion at the end of that 20 years was, don't help people. Don't need help. When people intervene, it just makes their lives worse. But give them the freedom to be entrepreneurs. And so how do you get started? And he uses a system he calls journaling. Just have people write down their ideas and then have other people comment on them, and eventually something will emerge. And he tells a wonderful story in one of his books about some refugees in the US. They came from Cambodia. They were kind of huddled together in Oakland in the United States. And they knew the recipe for a certain kind of donuts. And they wanted to make Cambodian donuts. And so somebody says, I think I can get some flour, and my mom knows the recipe. And somebody said, I think I can find some metal and we can make an oven. And somebody said, yeah, we could make donuts that way. And they started to do that. And then they had people deliver them to people's houses and got some money for them because there were plenty of Cambodians who wanted the donuts. And eventually they started a store, and eventually that became successful. And eventually they started a franchise, and it became a very successful business. And his point was, just get started. You can be an entrepreneur. Now, that's in the United States where it's possible to do that. I think some of the micro lending that has gone on in places like India, where you go into a village and you give a very, very, very small, tiny loan to maybe a woman who can start some kind of a business like Mauricio's mother, making dresses or doing something, providing some kind of a service. And it's been tremendously successful. So it bubbles up from the bottom. So you're right, we've got to fight the restrictions on entrepreneurship, and there's so much red tape and so much inability. But the evidence says just get people started. Even if they don't know how to start, just get them to elicit their own ideas, and it'll start from that microcosm. It'll build its way up. So I'm not trying to minimize the idea that it's hard in certain countries. I'm just saying the positive idea is everybody can get started because it's about people helping people, and that's universal.
Well, in that point, there's and we can talk about regulations. I mean, in order to do business, there are certain rules that you have to follow. These rules can be either imposed by government, or they can emerge by themselves. I mean, all businesses have a name. That's the rule. All businesses have a purpose. That's the rule. But also, all businesses have to, I don't know, fill tax reports. That's a government rule. What's the importance of rules in entrepreneurship and in business? Since, I mean, everything is actually regulated, either by choice or by imposition by the government.
Yeah, that's real life. That's the situation we live in. We have governments and we have their regulations. If you use the word rules in that Hayek sense, everybody works by general rules. So the entrepreneur's general rules is, how can I help other people and how can I make a profit while doing it? So that's the rule that entrepreneurs follow. It is always possible to work faster and more intelligently than the bureaucrats can work. And so maybe the business is not registered and it's a small local trading business. Maybe it's on the blockchain where people have a harder time, or regulators have a harder time restricting those smart contracts. I was talking to a young man in Germany on my podcast recently, and he introduced me to the world of free software. So you've got people who enjoy writing code. They develop software for free. They publish it on GitHub or somewhere like that. They offer it to people who might find it useful. There's no price on it, but if the user does find it useful, they're invited to send Bitcoin or fractions of Bitcoin, Satoshis, back to the entrepreneur who developed it. It's called a value for value exchange. So none of that is regulated. It's not a business. It's not registered. There's no income tax on it. So I just think entrepreneurs can always be smarter and faster than the regulators. I don't want them to go to jail. I don't want them to get into trouble. But there's always ways in which we're more intelligent and agile and nimble than the regulators.
Well, since you talked about Bitcoin and blockchain and those kind of stuff, cryptocurrencies, what do you think is their importance for the future of entrepreneurship and of business? You already gave us an example, but the blockchain and the crypto revolution is growing like crazy. So I think there's something in it.
Yes, I'm not technically adept, Ugo, but I listen to a lot of the discussions about Bitcoin and the blockchain. I think Bitcoin is a way to provide a better system than fiat currency, which we know has been detrimental to people and customers and entrepreneurs and everybody, because it's just a continuing devaluation of currency. It's an ongoing default. Countries in South America have much more difficult time than we've had in the US and in Europe, but it's universal. It's devaluing currency. It's for the benefit of the state and not the consumer. So what happens? Some entrepreneur develops an alternative. There are lots of alternatives in cryptocurrency. I'm of the feeling that Bitcoin is the one genuine alternative to fiat currency. But if you think like an Austrian, there's a very famous paper by Hayek where he said, that's the entrepreneurial solution. Let's have lots of competing currencies and the market will figure out which ones they want to support. So Bitcoin is kind of a version of that 1930s paper by Hayek. So I think it's really important. I think entrepreneurship will always beat regulation, will always be better than the government. Bitcoin's an example of that. People are now finding different ways to use Bitcoin. The new Lightning Network that's emerging makes Bitcoin more useful in transactions. You're never going to use it to buy a cup of coffee, but you can use it for other purposes. And if it proves valuable, it'll become wider and wider used, and it will dictate the future. So it's the entrepreneurial solution, and there are entrepreneurial solutions in healthcare and energy and all of those other areas that will always do better than the state solution.
All right, since we're almost finished, how could you describe entrepreneurship in a single sentence?
Well, it's really hard, but it is the orientation of an individual to empathically, using empathy, understand what another person needs and wants, and gathering the resources to provide them with a solution to those needs and wants. It's a cycle. It's a constant offering, reaction by the customer, getting that feedback loop. So it's a value cycle, and entrepreneurs are operators of the value cycle.
Well, I just come up with this question. What do you think is the relation between entrepreneurship and economies of scale? Because, well, I remember a lecture that Professor Sean Retourner gave me at the Mises Institute a few years ago. And I think that's the lecture that has impacted me the most. Right now I am remember that lecture. So what do you think is how do you relate economies of scale and entrepreneurship, since entrepreneurship is pretty much the first of the bricks in order to create a firm?
Yeah, I don't think economies of scale exist anymore, Ugo. I think that was a concept back from the industrial age where you had to build a giant steel mill or a giant automobile manufacturing plant, and the more units you sold, the better you could allocate the administrative costs across those units. So they came up with this idea of economies of scale. It may have existed back then, although I'm not really sure. I think there was more of a what they call a learning curve. We get to make it better the more units that we make. But in any case, today in the digital world, economies of scale are not relevant anymore. It's the economy of value. How can I create value efficiently for a consumer or a customer and make a profit? So Austrianism is the economy of value as opposed to the economies of scale. You can download scale from the internet, and Amazon has happily built Amazon Web Services. They got more servers than anybody else in the world, and you got Google with all of theirs. Maybe that's economies of scale, but it's not relevant to the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur says, I'll download my scale from Amazon and Google, and I'll worry about creating value. So individually, I just don't think about economies of scale.
One last question. So since value and, to create value for others is pretty much at the center of entrepreneurship, do you think that the value theory the subjective value theory is pretty much right for all economics, free market economics, since entrepreneurship is pretty much the blood that flows through the market?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital, Ugo, to understand subjectivism and subjective value. And Austrian economics has a very sophisticated and useful way of understanding that, and that's value as a process. So we think from the point of view of the consumer. So the consumer has some kind of anticipated value. The story always tells about eating a pizza. At some point, I'm hungry. I anticipate that there might be value in the future in eating a pizza because I've had one before, I've seen other people enjoy it. So then I look around for what are my options, and I look for the value proposition from the entrepreneur, somebody telling me they make a great pizza. At some point in time, I decide to buy it. So that's exchange value. Then I consume it. So that's the experience value. And after I consume it, I evaluate it. Did I enjoy it as much as I expected it to? So the entrepreneurship theory has to understand that whole cycle of value, and all of that's subjective. Everything is in the mind of the consumer. Now, at some point in time, there is an objective step, and that's the willingness to pay. I'll pay $10 for the pizza. That's objective. I gave the $10 and I got the pizza back. So it's quite complicated. It's hard to understand, but the subjectivism, the subjective value of the consumer And the subjectivism of the entrepreneur in following that value cycle is absolutely fundamental to understanding. Business schools don't teach it. Business books don't write it well. I think the Austrians have this, and we must find a way to communicate it so entrepreneurs understand it. It's really exciting and energizing, I think, and subjective value, you're right, is the key.
Well, many thanks for having joined us today, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you, to, well, learn so much, because I'm not really an economist. I am an economics enthusiast, so to speak. I'm more trained in law and politics, as you can see. But it's been great, and so many thanks for having joined us. Many thanks for having talked to us. Well, I hope to have you again on the program soon.
Good, I'd be happy to anytime. Thank you for the invitation, Ugo. I love what you're doing. It's really important task to share ideas this way and to have these kinds of discussions. And I'd be happy to come back anytime if you have any more questions. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you. And please, well, for the people who are watching us, who will watch us, you can subscribe to our channel. You can also check Hunter on his social media. On Twitter, you can check his the projects he's working on, Economics for Business at the Mises Institute. And, well, let me check. I think there's something about entrepreneurship as well, right?
Well, Economics for Business is the economics for entrepreneurs. And I'm in the process of developing what I call the Value Generation Handbook, which is a handbook for entrepreneurs. So I hope to have that available sometime in the future. Everything is about entrepreneurship. It's like De Soto said, it's the key to a happy and just society.
Well, thank you and see you soon.
Good. Thanks very much, Ugo.